Chapter 9. Monster Killing. There was a man in the turret, waiting to help me. He had a clip of 5 rounds in the gun, the searchlight on, and the view screen tuned to the forward pickup. After checking the gun and loading the chamber, I looked in that, and in the distance, lighted by the boat above and the searchlight of the javelin, I saw a long neck with a little head on the end of it weaving about. We were making straight for it, losing altitude and speed as we went. Then the neck dipped under the water and a little later reappeared, coming straight for the advancing light. The forward gun went off, shaking the ship with its recoil, and the head ducked under again. There was a spout from the shell behind it. I took my eyes from the forward screen and looked out the rear window, ready to shove my face into the sight mask. An instant later, the head and neck reappeared astern of us. I fired, without too much hope of hitting anything, and then the ship was rising and circling. As soon as I'd fired, the monster had sounded, head first. I fired a second shot at its tail in hope of crippling his steering gear, but that was a clean miss too, and then the ship was up to about 5,000 feet. My helper pulled out the partly empty clip and replaced it with a full one, giving me 5 and 1 in the chamber. If I'd been that monster, I thought, I'd have kept on going till I was a couple of 100 miles away from this place. But evidently that wasn't the way monsters thought, if thinking is what goes on inside a brain cavity the size of a quart bottle, in a head the size of 2 oil drums, on a body as big as the ship that was hunting him. He'd found a lot of gulpers and funnel mouths, and he wasn't going to be chased away from his dinner by somebody shooting at him. I wondered why they didn't eat screwfish, instead of the things that preyed on them. Maybe they did and we didn't know it. Or maybe they just didn't like screwfish. There were a lot of things we didn't know about sea monsters. For that matter, I wondered why we didn't grow tallow wax by carniculture. We could grow any other animal matter we wanted. I'd often thought of that. The monster wasn't showing any inclination to come to the surface again, and finally Joe Kivelson's voice came out of the intercom. "Run in the guns and seal ports. Secure for submersion. We're going down and chase him up." My helper threw the switch that retracted the gun and sealed the gun port. I checked that and reported. "After gun secure." Hans Kronje's voice a moment later said, "Forward gun secure." And then Ramon Llewellyn said, "Ship secure, ready to submerge." Then the javelin began to settle, and the water came up over the window. I didn't know what the radar was picking up. All I could see was the screen and the window. Water lighted for about 50 feet in front and behind. I saw a cloud of screwfish pass over and around us, spinning rapidly as they swam, as though on lengthwise axis. They always spin counterclockwise, never clockwise. A couple of funnel mouths were swimming after them, overtaking and engulfing them. Then the captain yelled, "Get set for torpedo!" and my helper and I each grabbed a stanchion. A couple of seconds later, it seemed as though King Neptune himself had given the ship a poke in the nose. My hands were almost jerked loose from their hold. Then she swung slowly, nosing up and down, and finally Joe Kivelson spoke again. "We're going to the surface. Get set to run the guns out and start shooting as soon as we're out of the water." "What happened?" I asked my helper. "Must have put the torp right under him and lifted him," he said. "He could be dead or stunned, or he could be live and active and spoiling for a fight." That last could be trouble. The Times had run quite a few stories, some with black borders, about ships that had gotten into trouble with monsters. A hunter ship is heavy, and it is well armored. Install hyperdrive engines in one, and you could take her from here to Terra. But a monster is a tough brute, and he has an armor of his own, scales an inch or so thick, and tougher than sole leather. A lot of chair seats around Port Sandor are made of single monster scales. A monster strikes with its head, like a snake. They could smash a ship's boat, and they've been known to punch armor glass windows out of their frames. I didn't want the window in front of me coming in at me with a monster head the size of a couple of oil drums and full of big tusks following it. The javelin came up fast, but not as fast as the monster, which seemed to have been injured only in his disposition. He was on the surface already, about 50 yards astern of us, threshing with his 40-foot wing fins, his neck arched back to strike. I started to swing my gun for the chest shot Joe Kyvelson had recommended as soon as it was run out, and then the ship was swung around and tilted up forward by a sudden gust of wind. While I was struggling to get the sights back on the monster, the ship gave another lurch, and the crosshairs were right on its neck, about 6 feet below the head. I grabbed the trigger, and as soon as the shot was off, took my eyes from the sights. I was just a second too late to see the burst, but not too late to see the monster's neck jerk one way out of the smoke puff and its head fly another. A second later, the window in front of me was splashed with blood as the headless neck came down on our fantail. Immediately, 2 rockets jumped from the launcher over the gun turret, planting a couple of harpoons, and the boat, which had been circling around since we had submerged, dived into the water and passed under the monster, coming up on the other side, dragging another harpoon line. The monster was still threshing its wings and flogging with its headless neck. It takes a monster quite a few minutes to tumble to the fact that it's been killed. My helper was pounding my back black and blue with one hand and trying to pump mine off with the other, and I was getting an ovation from all over the ship. At the same time, a couple more harpoons went into the thing from the ship, and the boat put in another one from behind. I gathered that shooting monsters' heads off wasn't at all usual, and hastened to pass it off as pure luck, so that everybody would hurry up and deny it before they got the same idea themselves. We hadn't much time for ovations, though. We had a very slowly dying monster, and before he finally discovered that he was dead, a couple of harpoons got pulled out and had to be replaced. Finally, however, he quieted down, and the boat swung him around, bringing the tail past our bow, and the ship cut contragravity to specific gravity level and settled to float on top of the water. The boat dived again and paid out a line that it brought up and around and up again, lashing the monster fast alongside. "All right," Kyvelson was saying out of the intercom. "Shooting's over. All hands for cutting up." I pulled on a parka and zipped it up and went out onto the deck. Everybody who wasn't needed at engines or controls was there, and equipment was coming up from below, power saws and sonocutters, and even a solenoid jackhammer. There were 6 floodlights on small contragravity lifters. They were run up on lines 50 feet above the ship's deck. By this time, it was completely dark, and fine snow was blowing. I could see that Joe Kyvelson was anxious to get the cutting up finished before the wind got any worse. "Walt, can you use a machine gun?" he asked me. I told him I could. I was sure of it. A machine gun is fired in a rational and decent manner. "Well, all right. Suppose you cover for us from the boat," he said. "Mr. Morrell can pilot for you. You never worked at cutting up before, and neither did he. You'd be more of a hindrance than a help, and so would he. But we do need a good machine gunner. As soon as we start throwing out waste, we'll have all the slashers and halberd fish for miles around. You just shoot them as fast as you see them." He was courteous enough not to add, "And don't shoot any of the crew." The boat came in and passed out the lines of its harpoons, and Morrell and I took the places of Cesario Vieira and the other man. We went up to the nose, and Morrell took his place at the controls, and I got back of the 7mm machine gun and made sure that there were plenty of extra belts of ammo. Then, as we rose, I pulled the goggles down from my hood, swung the gun away from the ship, and hammered off a 1-second burst to make sure it was working, after which I settled down, glad I had a comfortable seat and wasn't climbing around on that monster. They began knocking scales loose with the jackhammer and cutting into the leathery skin underneath with sonocutters. The sea was getting heavy, and the ship and the attached monster had begun to roll. "That's pretty dangerous work," Morell said. "If a man using one of those cutters slipped—" "It's happened," I told him. "You met our peg-legged compositor, Julio? That was how he lost his leg." "I don't blame them for wanting all they can get for tallow wax." They had the monster open down the belly, and were beginning to cut loose big chunks of the yellow tallow wax and throw them into cargo nets and swing them aboard with lifters, to be chucked down the cargo hatches. I was only able to watch that for a minute or so and tell Morell what was going on, and then the first halberd fish, with a spear-like nose and sharp ridges of the nearest thing to bone you find on Fenris, came swimming up. I swung the gun on the leader and gave him a second of fire, and then a 2-second burst on the ones behind. Then I waited for a few seconds until the survivors converged on their dead and injured companions and gave them another burst, which wiped out the lot of them. It was only a couple of seconds after that the first slasher came in, shiny as heat-blued steel and waving 4 clawed tentacles that grew around its neck. It took me a second or so to get the sights on him. He stopped slashing immediately. Slashers are smart. You kill them, and they find it out right away. Before long, the water around the ship and the monster was polluted with things like that. I had to keep them away from the men, now working up to their knees in water, and at the same time avoid massacring the crew I was trying to protect, and Morell had to keep the boat in position in spite of a steadily rising wind, and every time I had to change belts, there'd be a new rush of things that had to be shot in a hurry. The ammunition bill for covering a cutting-up operation is one of the things that runs up expenses for a hunter ship. The ocean bottom around here must be carpeted with machine gun brass. Finally, they got the job done, and everybody went below and sealed ship. We sealed the boat and went down after her. The last I saw, the remains of the monster, now stripped of wax, had been cast off, and the water around it was rioting with slashers and clawbeaks and halberd fish and similar marine unpleasantness. Chapter 10. Mayday, Mayday. Getting a ship's boat berthed inside the ship in the air is tricky work under the best of conditions. The way the wind was blowing by now, it would have been like trying to thread a needle inside a concrete mixer. We submerged after the ship and went in underwater. Then we had to wait in the boat until the ship rose above the surface and emptied the water out of the boat berth. When that was done and the boat berth was sealed again, the ship went down 70 fathoms and came to rest on the bottom, and we unsealed the boat and got out. There was still the job of packing the wax into skins, but that could wait. Everybody was tired and dirty and hungry. We took turns washing up, 3 at a time, in the little ship's latrine, which, for some reason, going back to sailing ship days on Terra, was called the Head. Finally, the whole 16 of us gathered in the relatively comfortable wardroom under the after gun turret. Comfortable, that is, to the extent that everybody could find a place to sit down, or could move about without tripping over somebody else. There was a big pot of coffee, and everybody had a plate or bowl of hot food. There's always plenty of hot food to hand on a hunter ship. No regular mealtimes, and everybody eats, as he sleeps, when he has time. This is the only time when a whole hunter crew gets together, after a monster has been killed and cut up, and the ship is resting on the bottom, and nobody has to stand watch. Everybody was talking about the killing, of course, and the wax we had in the hold, and counting the money they were going to get for it, at the now 80 cent a soul price. "Well, I make it about 14 tons. Ramon Llewellyn, who had been checking the wax as it went into the hold, said. He figured mentally for a moment, and then added, "Call it 22,000 souls." Then he had to fall back on a pencil and paper to figure shares. I was surprised to find that he was reckoning shares for both Morrell and myself. "Hey, do we want to let them do that?" I whispered to Morrell. "We just came along for the ride." "I don't want the money," he said. "These people need every cent they can get." So did I, for that matter, and I didn't have salary and expense account from a big company on Terra. However, I hadn't come along in the expectation of making anything out of it, and a newsman has to be careful about the outside money he picks up. It wouldn't do any harm in the present instance, but as a practice, it can lead to all kinds of things, like playing favorites, coloring news, killing stories that shouldn't be killed. We do enough of that as it is, like playing down the tread snail business for Bish Ware and the spaceport people, and never killing anybody except in a local bar. It's hard to draw a line on that sort of thing. "We're just guests," I said. "We don't work here." "The dickens you are," Joe Kyvelson contradicted. "Maybe you came aboard as guests, but you're both part of the crew now. I never saw a prettier shot on a monster than Walt made. Took that thing's head off like a chicken on a chopping block. And he did a swell job of covering for the cutting up. And he couldn't have done that if Morrell hadn't handled the boat the way he did, and that was no easy job." "Well, let's talk about that when we get to port," I said. "Are we going right back, or are we going to try for another monster?" "I don't know," Joe said. "We could stow the wax, if we didn't get too much, but if we stay out, we'll have to wait out the wind, and by then it'll be pretty cold." "The longer we stay out, the more the cruise'll cost," Abdullah Monahan, the engineer, said. "And the expenses'll cut into the shares." "Tell the truth, I'm sort of antsy to get back," Joe Kyvelson said. "I want to see what's going on in Port Sandor." "So am I," Morrell said. "I want to get some kind of office opened, and get into business. What time will the Cape Canaveral be getting in? I want a big cargo for the first time." "Oh, not for 400 hours, at the least," I said. "The spaceships always try to miss the early dark and early daylight storms. It's hard to get a big ship down in a high wind." "That'll be plenty of time, I suppose," Morrell said. "There's all that wax you have stored, and what I can get out of the cooperative stores from crews that reclaim it. But I'm going to have a lot to do." "Yes," I agreed. "Dodging bullets, for one." "Oh, I don't expect any trouble," Morrell said. "This fellow Ravik shot his round." He was going to say something else, but before he could say it, there was a terrific roar forward. The whole ship bucked like a recoiling gun, throwing everybody into a heap, and heeled over to starboard. There were a lot of yells, particularly from those who had been splashed with hot coffee, and somebody was shouting something about the magazines. "The magazines are aft, you dunderhead," Joe Kyvelson told him, shoving himself to his feet. "Stay put, everybody. I'll see what it is." He pulled open the door forward. An instant later, he slammed it shut and was dogging it fast. "Hull must be ruptured forward. We're making water. It's spouting up the hatch from the engine room like a geyser," he said. "Ramon, go see what it's like in the boat berth. The rest of you follow him and grab all the food and warm clothing you can. We're going to have to abandon." He stood by the doorway aft, shoving people through and keeping them from jamming up, saying, "Take it easy now. Don't crowd. We'll all get out." There wasn't any panic. A couple of men were in the doorway of the little galley when I came past, handing out cases of food. As nothing was coming out at the instant, I kept on, and on the way back to the boat berth hatch I pulled down as many parkas and pairs of overpants as I could carry, squeezing past Tom, who was collecting fleece-lined hip boots. Each pair was buckled together at the tops. A hunter always does that, even at home ashore. Ramon had the hatch open and had opened the top hatch of the boat below. I threw my double armload of clothing down through it and slid down after, getting out of the way of the load of boots Tom dumped ahead of him. Joe Kyvelson came down last, carrying the ship's log and some other stuff. A little water was trickling over the edge of the hatch above. "It's squirting up from below in a dozen places," he said, after he'd sealed the boat. "The whole front of the ship must be blown out." "Well, now we know what happened to Simon McGregor's claymore," I said, more to myself than to anybody else. Joe and Hans Kronya, the gunner, were getting a rocket out of the locker, detaching the harpoon and fitting on an explosive warhead. He stopped, while he and Kronya were loading it into the after-launcher, and nodded at me. "That's what I think, too," he said. "Everybody, grab onto something. We're getting the door open." I knew what was coming, and started hugging a stanchion as though it were a long-lost sweetheart, and Morell, who didn't, but knew enough to imitate those who did, hugged it from the other side. The rocket whooshed out of the launcher and went off with a deafening bang outside. For an instant, nothing happened, and I told Morell not to let go. Then the lock burst in, and the water, at 70 fathoms pressure, hit the boat. Abdullah had gotten the engines on and was backing against it. After a little, the pressure equalized, and we went out the broken lock stern first. We circled and passed over the Javelin, and then came back. She was lying in the ooze, a quarter over on her side, and her whole bow was blown out to port. Joe Kyvelson got the square box he had brought down from the ship along with the log, fussed a little with it, and then launched it out the disposal port. It was a radio locator. Sometimes a lucky ship will get more wax than the hold's capacity. They pack it in skins and anchor it on the bottom, and drop one of those gadgets with it. It would keep on sending a directional signal and the name of the ship for a couple of years. "Do you really think it was sabotage?" Morell was asking me. Blowing up a ship with 16 men aboard must have seemed sort of extreme to him. Maybe that wasn't according to Terran business ethics. "Mightn't have been a power unit?" "No, power units don't blow, and if one did, it would vaporize the whole ship and a quarter of a cubic mile of water around her. No, that was old-fashioned, country-style chemical explosive. Cataclysmite, probably." "Ravik?" he asked, rather unnecessarily. "You know how well he can get along without you and Joe Kyvelson, and here's a chance to get along without both of you together." Everybody in the boat was listening, so I continued. "How much do you know about this fellow Davis, who strained his back at the last moment?" "Engine room's where he could have planted something," Joe Kyvelson said. "He was in there by himself for a while, the morning after the meeting," Abdullah Monahan added. "And he disappeared between the meeting room and the elevator during the fight," Tom mentioned. "And when he showed up, he hadn't been marked up any. I'd have thought he'd been pretty badly beaten, unless they knew he was one of their own gang." "We're going to look Davis up when we get back," somebody said pleasantly. "If we get back," Ramon Llewellyn told him. "That's going to take some doing." "We have the boat," Hans Kronya said. "It's a little crowded, but we can make it back to Port Sandor." "I hope we can," Abe Clifford, the navigator, said. "Shall we take her up, Joe?" "Yes, see what it's like on top," the skipper replied. Going up, we passed a monster at about 30 fathoms. It stuck its neck out and started for us. Monahan tilted the boat almost vertical and put on everything the engines had, lift and drive parallel. An instant later, we broke the surface and shot into the air. The wind hit the boat as though it had been a ping-pong ball, and it was several seconds, and bad seconds at that, before Monahan regained even a semblance of control. There was considerable bad language, and several of the crew had bloody noses. Monahan tried to get the boat turned into the wind. A circuit breaker popped, and red lights blazed all over the instrument panel. He eased off and let the wind take over, and for a while we were flying in front of it like a rifle bullet. Gradually, he nosed down and submerged. "Well, that's that," Joe Kyvelson said, when we were back in the underwater calm again. "We'll have to stay under till the wind's over. Don't anybody move around or breathe any deeper than you have to. We'll have to conserve oxygen." "Isn't the boat equipped with electrolytic gills?" Morell asked. "Sure, to supply oxygen for a maximum of 6 men. We have 16 in here." "How long will our air last, for 16 of us?" I asked. "About 8 hours. It would take us 50 to get to Port Sandor, running submerged. The wind wouldn't even begin to fall in less than 20. "We can go south, to the coast of Herman Roach's land," Abe Clifford, the navigator, said. "Let me figure something out." He dug out a slide rule and a pencil and pad and sat down with his back to the back of the pilot's seat, under the light. Everybody watched him in a silence, which Joe Kyvelson broke suddenly by bellowing, "Dumont, you light that pipe, and I'll feed it to you." Old Piet Dumont grabbed the pipe out of his mouth with one hand and pocketed his lighter with the other. "Gosh, Joe, I guess I just wasn't thinking," he began. "Well, give me that pipe." Joe put it in the drawer under the charts. "Now you won't have it handy the next time you don't think." After a while, Abe Clifford looked up. "Ship's position I don't have exactly. Somewhere around east 25 longitude, south 20 latitude. I can't work out our present position at all, except that we're somewhere around south 30 latitude. The locator signal is almost exactly north by northeast of us. If we keep it dead astern, we'll come out in Sancerre Bay, on Herman Rauch's land. If we make that, we're all right. We'll be in the lee of the Hacksaw Mountains, and we can surface from time to change air, and as soon as the wind falls, we can start for home." Then he and Abdullah and Joe went into a huddle, arguing about cruising speed submerged. The results weren't so heartening. "It looks like a 10-hour trip submerged," Joe said. "That's 2 hours too long, and there's no way of getting more oxygen out of the gills than we're getting now. We'll just have to use less. Everybody lie down and breathe as shallowly as possible, and don't do anything to use energy. I'm going to get on the radio and see what I can raise." Big chance, I thought. These boat radios were only used for communicating with the ship while scouting. They had a strain-everything range of about 300 miles. Hunter ships don't crowd that close together when they're working. Still, there was a chance that somebody else might be sitting it out on the bottom within hearing. So Abe took the controls and kept the signal from the wreck of the Javelin dead astern, and Joe Kyvelson began speaking into the radio. "Mayday! Mayday! 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 Captain Kyvelson, Javelin calling. My ship was wrecked by an explosion. All hands now in scout boat, proceeding toward Sancerre Bay, on course south by southwest from the wreck. Locator signals being broadcast from the Javelin. Other than that, we do not know our position. Calling all craft. Calling Mayday." He stopped talking. The radio was silent, except for an occasional frying fat crackle of static. Then he began over again. I curled up, trying to keep my feet out of anybody's face and my face clear of anybody else's feet. Somebody began praying, and somebody else told him to belay it. He was wasting oxygen. I tried to go to sleep, which was the only practical thing to do. I must have succeeded. When I woke again, Joe Kyvelson was saying exasperatedly, "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" Chapter 11. Darkness and Cold. The next time I woke, Tom Kyvelson was reciting the Mayday, Mayday incantation into the radio, and his father was asleep. The man who had been praying had started again, and nobody seemed to care whether he wasted oxygen or not. It was a theosophist prayer to the spirit guides, and I remembered that Cesario Vieira was a theosophist. Well, maybe there really were spirit guides. If there were, we'd all be finding out before long. I found that I didn't care one hoot which way, and I set that down to oxygen deficiency. Then Glenn Morrell broke in on the monotone call for help and the prayer. "We're done for if we stay down here another hour," he said. "Any argument on that?" There wasn't any. Joe Kyvelson opened his eyes and looked around. "We haven't raised anything at all on the radio," Morrell went on. "That means nobody's within an hour of reaching us. Am I right?" "I guess that's about the size of it," Joe Kyvelson conceded. "How close to land are we?" "The radar isn't getting anything but open water and schools of fish," Abe Clifford said. "For all I know, we could be inside Sansir Bay now." "Well, then why don't we surface?" Morrell continued. "It's 1,000 to 1 against us, but if we stay here, our chances are precisely 100% negative." "What do you think?" Joe asked generally. "I think Mr. Morrell stated it correctly." "There is no death," Cesario said. "Death is only change, and then more of life. I don't care what you do." "What have we got to lose?" somebody else asked. "We're broke and gambling on credit now." "All right, we surface," the skipper said. "Everybody grab onto something. We'll take the Niflheim of us slamming around as soon as we're out of the water." We woke up everybody who was sleeping, except the 3 men who had completely lost consciousness. Those we wrapped up in blankets and tarpaulins, like mummies, and lashed them down. We gathered everything that was loose and made it fast, checked the fastenings of everything else. Then Abdullah Monahan pointed the nose of the boat straight up and gave her everything the engines could put out. Just as we were starting upward, I heard Cesario saying, "If anybody wants to see me in the next reincarnation, I can tell you one thing, I won't reincarnate again on Fenris." The headlights only penetrated 50 or 60 feet ahead of us. I could see slashers and clawbeaks and funnel mouths and gulpers and things like that getting out of our way in a hurry. Then we were out of the water and shooting straight up in the air. It was the other time all over again, doubled in spades, only this time Abdullah didn't try to fight it. He just kept the boat rising. Then it went end over end, again and again. I think most of us blacked out. I'm sure I did, for a while. Finally, more by good luck than good management, he got us turned around with the wind behind us. That lasted for a while, and then we started keyholing again. I could see the instrument panel from where I'd lashed myself fast. It was going completely bughouse. Once, out the window in front, I could see jagged mountains ahead. I just shut my eyes and waited for the spirit guides to come and pick up the pieces. When they weren't along, after a few seconds that seemed like half an hour, I opened my eyes again. There were more mountains ahead, and mountains to the right. This'll do it, I thought, and I wondered how long it would take Dad to find out what had happened to us. Cesario had started praying again, and so had Abdullah Monahan, who had just remembered that he had been brought up a Moslem. I hope he wasn't trying to pray in the direction of Mecca, even allowing that he knew which way Mecca was from Fenris generally. That made me laugh, and then I thought, this is a fine time to be laughing at anything. Then I realized that things were so bad that anything more that happened was funny. I was still laughing when I discovered that the boat had slowed to a crawl, and we were backing in between two high cliffs. Evidently, Abdullah, who had now stopped praying, had gotten enough control of the boat to keep her into the wind and was keeping enough speed forward to yield to it gradually. That would be all right, I thought, if the force of the wind stayed constant, and as soon as I thought of that, it happened. We got into a relative calm. The boat went forward again, and then was tossed up and spun around. Then I saw a mountain slope directly behind us, out the rear window. A moment later, I saw rocks and boulders sticking out of it in apparent defiance of gravitation, and then I realized that it was level ground and we were coming down at it backward. That lasted a few seconds, and then we hit stern on, bounced, and hit again. I was conscious up to the third time we hit. The next thing I knew, I was hanging from my lashings from the side of the boat, which had become the top, and the headlights and the lights on the control panel were out, and Joe Kyvelson was holding a flashlight while Abe Clifford and Glenn Morrell were trying to get me untied and lower me. I also noticed that the air was fresh and very cold. "Hey, we're down," I said, as though I were telling anybody anything they didn't know. "How many are still alive?" "As far as I know, all of us," Joe said. "I think I have a broken arm." I noticed then that he was holding his left arm stiffly at his side. Morrell had a big gash on top of his head, and he was mopping blood from his face with his sleeve while he worked. When they got me down, I looked around. Somebody else was playing with a flashlight around at the stern, which was completely smashed. It was a miracle the rocket locker hadn't blown up, but the main miracle was that all, or even any of us, were still alive. We found a couple of lights that could be put on, and we got all of us picked up, and the unconscious revived. One man, Dominic Silverstein, had a broken leg. Joe Kyvelson's arm was, as he suspected, broken. Another man had a fractured wrist, and Abdullah Monahan thought a couple of ribs were broken. The rest of us were in one piece, but all of us were cut and bruised. I felt sore all over. We also found a nuclear electric heater that would work, and got it on. Tom and I rigged some tarpaulins to screen off the ruptured stern and keep out the worst of the cold air. After they got through setting and splinting the broken bones and taping up Abdullah's ribs, Cesario and Morrell got some water out of one of the butts and started boiling it for coffee. I noticed that Piet Dumont had recovered his pipe and was smoking it, and Joe Kyvelson had his lit. "Well, where are we?" somebody was asking Abe Clifford. The navigator shook his head. "The radio's smashed, so's the receiver for the locator, and so's the radio navigational equipment. I can state positively, however, that we are on the north coast of Herman Rauch's land." Everybody laughed at that, except Morrell. I had to explain to him that Herman Rauch's land was the Antarctic continent of Fenris, and hasn't any other coast. "I'd say we're a good deal west of San Cyr Bay," Cesario Vieira hazarded. "We can't be east of it, the way we got blown west. I think we must be at least 500 miles east of it." "Don't fool yourself, Cesario," Joe Kyvelson told him. "We could have gotten into a turbulent updraft and been carried to the upper eastward winds. The altimeter was trying to keep up with the boat and just couldn't, half the time. I don't know where we went. I'll take Abe's estimate and let it go at that." "Well, we're up some kind of a fjord," Tom said. "I think it branches like a Y, and we're up the left branch, but I won't make a point of that." "I can't find anything like that on this map," Abe Clifford said after a while. Joe Kyvelson swore. "You ought to know better than that, Abe. You know how thoroughly this coast hasn't been mapped." "How much good will it do us to know where we are right now?" I asked. "If the radio's smashed, we can't give anybody our position." "We might be able to fix up the engines and get the boat in the air again after the wind drops," Monahan said. "I'll take a look at them and see how badly they've been banged up." "With the whole stern open?" Hans Kronya asked. "We'd freeze stiffer than a gun barrel before we went 100 miles. "Then we can pack the stern full of wet snow and let it freeze instead of us," I suggested. "There'll be plenty of snow before the wind goes down." Joe Kyvelson looked at me for a moment. "That would work," he said. "How soon can you get started on the engines, Abdullah?" "Right away. I'll need somebody to help me, though. I can't do much the way you have me bandaged up." "I think we better send a couple of parties out," Ramon Llewellyn said. "We'll have to find a better place to stay than this boat. We don't have all the parkas or lined boots, and we have a couple of injured men. This heater won't be enough. In about 70 hours, we'd all freeze to death sitting around it." Somebody mentioned the possibility of finding a cave. "I doubt it," Llewellyn said. "I was on an exploring expedition down here once. This is all igneous rock, mostly granite. There aren't many caves. But there may be some sort of natural shelter, or something we can make into a shelter not too far away. We have 2 half-ton lifters. We could use them to pile up rocks and build something. Let's make up 2 parties. I'll take one. Abe, you take the other. One of us can go up, and the other can go down." We picked parties, trying to get men who had enough clothing and hadn't been too badly banged around in the landing. Tom wanted to go along, but Abdullah insisted that he stay and help with the inspection of the boat's engines. Finally, 6 of us, Llewellyn, myself, Glenn Morrell, Abe Clifford, old Piet Dumont, and another man, went out through the broken stern of the boat. We had 2 portable floodlights. A scout boat carries a lot of equipment, and Llewellyn took the one and Clifford the other. It had begun to snow already, and the wind was coming straight up the narrow ravine into which we had landed, driving it at us. There was a stream between the 2 walls of rock, swollen by the rains that had come just before the darkness, and the rocks in and beside it were coated with ice. We took one look at it and shook our heads. Any exploring we did would be done without trying to cross that. We stood for a few minutes trying to see through the driving snow, and then we separated. Abe Clifford, Dumont, and the other man going up the stream, and Ramon Llewellyn, Glenn Morrell, and I going down. A few hundred yards below the boat, the stream went over a 50-foot waterfall. We climbed down beside it and found the ravine widening. It was a level beach now, or what had been a beach thousands of years ago. The whole coast of Herman Rauch's land is sinking in the eastern hemisphere and rising in the western. We turned away from the stream and found that the wind was increasing in strength and coming at us from the left instead of in front. The next thing we knew, we were at the point of the mountain on our right, and we could hear the sea roaring ahead and on both sides of us. Tom had been right about that V-shaped fjord, I thought. We began running into scattered trees now, and when we got around the point of the mountain, we entered another valley. Trees, like everything else on Fenris, are considerably different from anything analogous on normal planets. They aren't tall, the biggest not more than 15 feet high, but they are from 6 to 8 feet thick, with all the branches at the top, sprouting out in all directions and reminding me of pictures of Medusa. The outside bark is a hard shell, which grows during the beginning of our 4 hot seasons a year. Under that will be more bark, soft and spongy, and this gets more and more dense toward the middle. And then comes the hardwood core, which may be as much as 2 feet thick. "One thing, we have firewood," Morrell said, looking at them. "What'll we cut it with? Our knives?" I wanted to know. "Oh, we have a sauna cutter on the boat," Ramon Llewellyn said. "We can chop these things into 1,000-pound chunks and float them to camp with the lifters. We could soak the spongy stuff on the outside with water and let it freeze, and build a hut out of it, too." He looked around, as far as the light penetrated the driving snow. "This wouldn't be a bad place to camp." Not if we're going to try to work on the boat, I thought. And packing Dominic, with his broken leg, down over that waterfall was something I didn't want to try either. I didn't say anything. Wait till we got back to the boat. It was too cold and windy here to argue, and besides, we didn't know what Abe and his party might have found upstream. Chapter 12. Castaways Working. We had been away from the boat for about 2 hours. When we got back, I saw that Abdullah and his helpers had gotten the deck plates off the engine well and used them to build a more substantial barricade at the ruptured stern. The heater was going, and the boat was warm inside, not just relatively to the outside, but actually comfortable. It was even more crowded, however, because there was a ton of collapsium shielding in 4 sections, and the generator and power unit piled in the middle. Abdullah and Tom and Hans Kronje were looking at the converters, which to my not very knowing eye seemed to be in a hopeless mess. There was some more work going on up at the front. Cesario Vieira had found a small portable radio that wasn't in too bad condition, and had it apart. I thought he was going about the most effective work of anybody, and waited over the pile of engine parts to see what he was doing. It wasn't much of a radio. 100 miles was the absolute limit of its range, at least for sending. "Is this all we have?" I asked, looking at it. It was the same type as the one I carried on the job, camouflaged in a camera case, except that it wouldn't record. "There's the regular boat radio, but it's smashed up pretty badly. I was thinking we could do something about cannibalizing one radio out of parts from both of them. We used a lot of radio equipment on the Times, and I do a good bit of work on it. I started taking the big set apart, and then remembered the receiver for the locator and got at that, too. The trouble was that most of the stuff in all the sets had been miniaturized to a point where watchmakers' tools would have been pretty large for working on them, and all we had was a general repair kit that was just about fine enough for gunsmithing. While we were fooling around with the radios, Ramon Llewellyn was telling the others what we found up the other branch of the fjord. Joe Kyvelson shook his head over it. "That's too far from the boat. We can't trudge back and forth to work on the engines. We could cut firewood down there and float it up with the lifters, and I think that's a good idea about using slabs of the soft wood to build a hut. But let's build the hut right here." "Well, suppose I take a party down now and start cutting?" the mate asked. "Not yet. Wait till Abe gets back and we see what he found upstream. There may be something better up there." Tom, who had been poking around in the converters, said, "I think we can forget about the engines. This is a machine shop job. We need parts, and we haven't anything to make them out of or with." That was about what I'd thought. Tom knew more about lift-and-drive engines than I'd ever learn, and I was willing to take his opinion as confirmation of my own. "Tom, take a look at this mess," I said. "See if you can help us with it." He came over, looked at what we were working on, and said, "You need a magnifier for this. Wait till I see something." Then he went over to one of the lockers, rummaged in it, and found a pair of binoculars. He came over to us again, sat down, and began to take them apart. As soon as he had the 2 big objective lenses out, we had 2 fairly good magnifying lenses. That was a big help, but being able to see what had to be done was one thing, and having tools to do it was another. So he found a sewing kit and a piece of emery stone, and started making little screwdrivers out of needles. After a while, Abe Clifford and Piet Dumont and the other man returned and made a beeline for the heater and the coffee pot. After Abe was warmed a little, he said, "There's a little waterfall about half a mile up. It isn't too hard to get up over it, and above, the ground levels out into a big, bowl-shaped depression that looks as if it had been a lake bottom once. The wind isn't so bad up there, and this whole lake bottom, or whatever it is grown up with trees. It would be a good place to make a camp, if it wasn't so far from the boat." "How hard would it be to cut wood up there and bring it down?" Joe asked, going on to explain what he had in mind. "Why, easy. I don't think it would be nearly as hard as the place Ramon found." "Neither do I," the mate agreed. "Climbing up that waterfall down the stream with a half-tree trunk would be a lot harder than dropping one over beside the one above." He began zipping up his parka. "Let's get the cutter and the lifters and go up now." "Wait till I warm up a little, and I'll go with you," Abe said. Then he came over to where Cesario and Tom and I were working, to see what we were doing. He chucked appreciatively at the midget screwdrivers and things Tom was making. "I'll take that back, Ramon," he said. "I can do a lot more good right here. Have you taken any of the radio navigational equipment apart yet?" he asked us. We hadn't. We didn't know anything about it. "Well, I think we can get some stuff out of the astro-compass that can be used. Let me in here, will you?" I got up. "You take over for me," I said. "I'll go on the wood-chopping detail." Tom wanted to go too. Abe told him to keep on with his tool-making. Piet Dumont said he'd guide us, and Glenn Morrell said he'd go along. There was some swapping around of clothes, and we gathered up the 2 lifters and the sonocutter and a floodlight and started upstream. The waterfall above the boat was higher than the one below, but not quite so hard to climb, especially as we had the 2 lifters to help us. The worst difficulty, and the worst danger, was from the wind. Once we were at the top, though, it wasn't so bad. We went a couple of 100 yards through a narrow gorge, and then we came out onto the old lake bottom Abe had spoken about. As far as our lights would shine in the snow, we could see stubby trees with snaky branches growing out of the tops. We just started on the first one we came to, slicing the down-hanging branches away to get at the trunk and then go to work on that. We took turns using the sonocutter, and the rest of us stamped around to keep warm. The first trunk must have weighed 1.5 tons, even after the branches were all off. We could barely lift one end of it with both lifters. The spongy stuff, which changed from bark to wood as it went into the middle, was 2 feet thick. We cut that off in slabs to use for building the hut. The hardwood core, once we could get it lit, would make a fine hot fire. We could cut that into burnable pieces after we got it to camp. We didn't bother with the slashings, just threw them out of the way. There was so much big stuff here that the branches weren't worth taking in. We had 8 trees down and cut into slabs and billets before we decided to knock off. We didn't realize until then how tired and cold we were. A couple of us had taken the wood to the waterfall and heaved it over at the side as fast as the others got the trees down and cut up. If we only had another cutter and a couple more lifters, I thought. If we only had an airworthy boat. When we got back to camp, everybody who wasn't crippled and had enough clothes to get away from the heater came out and helped. First, we got a fire started. There was a small arc torch, and we needed that to get the dense hardwood burning. And then we began building a hut against the boat. Everybody worked on that but Dominic Silverstein. Even Abe and Cesario knocked off work on the radio, and Joe Kyvelson and the man with the broken wrist gave us a little one-handed help. By this time, the wind had fallen and the snow was coming down thicker. We made snow shovels out of the hard outer bark, although they broke in use pretty often, and banked snow up against the hut. I lost track of how long we worked, but finally we had a place we could all get into with a fireplace, and it was as warm and comfortable as the inside of the boat. We had to keep cutting wood, though. Before long, it would be too cold to work up in the woods, or even go back and forth between the woods and the camp. The snow had finally stopped, and then the sky began to clear, and we could see stars. That didn't make us happy at all. As long as the sky was clouded and the snow was falling, some of the heat that had been stored during the long day was being conserved. Now it was all radiating away into space. The stream froze completely, even the waterfall. In a way, that was a help. We could slide wood down over it, and some of the billets would slide a couple of 100 yards downstream. But the cold was getting to us. We only had a few men working at wood-cutting, Cesario and old Piet Dumont and Abe Clifford and I, because we were the smallest and could wear bigger men's parkas and overpants over our own. But as long as any of us could pile on enough clothing and waddle out of the hut, we didn't dare stop. If the firewood ran out, we'd all freeze stiff in no time at all. Abe Clifford got the radio working at last. It was a peculiar job as ever was, but he thought it would have a range of about 500 miles. Somebody kept at it all the time, calling Mayday. I think it was Bish Ware who told me that Mayday didn't have anything to do with the day after the last day of April. It was an old Terran French, M'day, meaning help me. I wondered how Bish was getting along, and I wasn't too optimistic about him. Cesario and Abe and I were up at the waterfall, picking up loads of firewood. We weren't bothering now with anything but the hard and slow-burning cores, and had just gotten 2 of them hooked onto the lifters. I straightened for a moment and looked around. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and 2 of Fenris's 3 moons were making everything as bright as day. The glisten of the snow and the frozen waterfall in the double moonlight was beautiful. I turned to Cesario. "See what all you'll miss if you take your next reincarnation off Fenris," I said. "This, and the long sunsets and sunrises, and—" Before I could list any more sights unique to our planet, the 7mm machine gun down at the boat began hammering. A short burst, and then another, and another, and another. Chapter 13. The Beacon Light. We all said, "Shooting!" and "the machine gun," as though we had to tell each other what it was. "Something's attacking them," Cesario guessed. "Oh, there isn't anything to attack them now," Abe said. "All the critters are dug in for the winter. I'll bet they're just using it to chop wood with." That could be. A few short bursts would knock off all the soft wood from one of those big billets and expose the hard core. Only, why didn't they use the cutter? It was at the boat now. "We better go see what it is," Cesario insisted. "It might be trouble." None of us was armed. We'd never thought we'd need weapons. There are quite a few Fenrisian land animals, all creepers or crawlers, that are dangerous, but they spend the extreme hot and cold periods in burrows, in almost cataleptic sleep. It occurred to me that something might have burrowed among the rocks near the camp and been roused by the heat of the fire. We hadn't carried a floodlight with us. There was no need for one in the moonlight. Of the 2 at camp, one was pointed up the ravine toward us, and the other into the air. We began yelling as soon as we caught sight of them, not wanting to be dusted over lightly with 7mm before anybody recognized us. As soon as the men at the camp heard us, the shooting stopped, and they started shouting to us. Then we could distinguish words. "Come on in! We made contact!" We pushed into the hut, where everybody was crowded around the underhatch of the boat, which was now the side door. Abe shoved through, and I shoved in after him. Newsman's conditioned reflex. Get to where the story is. I even caught myself saying, "Press," as I shoved past Abdullah Monahan. "What happened?" I asked as soon as I was inside. I saw Joe Kyvelson getting up from the radio and making place for Abe. "Who did you contact?" "The Mahatma, Hell Diver," he said. "Signal's faint, but plain. They're trying to make a directional fix on us. There are about a dozen ships out looking for us. Helldiver, Pequod, Bulldog, Dirty Gertie," he went on naming them. "How did they find out?" I wanted to know. "Somebody pick up our Mayday while we were cruising submerged?" Abe Clifford was swearing into the radio. "No, of course not. We don't know where in Niflheim we are. All the instruments in the boat were smashed." "Well, can't you shoot the stars, Abe?" The voice, I thought it was Feinberg's, was almost as inaudible as a cat's sneeze. "Sure we can. If you're in range of this makeshift set, the position we'd get would be practically the same as yours," Abe told him. "Look, there's a floodlight pointed straight up. Can you see that?" "In all this moonlight? We could be half a mile away and not see it." "We've been firing with a 7mm, the navigator said. "I know. I heard it. On the radio. Have you got any rockets? Maybe if you shot one of them up, we could see it." "Hey, that's an idea. Hans, have we another rocket with an explosive head?" Cronje said we had, and he and another man got it out and carried it from the boat. I repeated my question to Joe Kyvelson. "No, your dad tried to call the Javelin by screen. That must have been after we abandoned ship. We didn't get an answer, and put out a general call. Nip Spazzoni was nearest, and he cruised around and picked up the locator signal and found the wreck, with the boat berth blown open and the boat gone. Then everybody started looking for us." Feinberg was saying that he'd call the other ships and alert them. If the Helldiver was the only ship we could contact by radio, the odds were that if they couldn't see the rocket from Feinberg's ship, nobody else could. The same idea must have occurred to Abe Clifford. "You say you're all along the coast. Are the other ships west or east of you?" "West, as far as I know." "Then we must be way east of you. Where are you now?" "About 500 miles east of Sancerre Bay." That meant we must be at least 1,000 miles east of the bay. I could see how that happened. Both times the boat had surfaced, it had gone straight up, lift and drive operating together. There is a constant wind away from the sunlight zone at high level, heated air that has been lifted, and there is a wind at a lower level out of the dark zone, coming in to replace it. We'd gotten completely above the latter and into the former. There was some yelling outside, and then I could hear Hans Cronje. "Rockets ready for vertical launching. 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Rocket off." There was a whoosh outside. Clifford, at the radio, repeated, "Rocket off." Then it banged high overhead. "Did you see it?" he asked. "Didn't see a thing," Feinberg told him. "Hey, I know what they would see," Tom Kyvelson burst out. "Say we go up and set the woods on fire." "Hey, that's an idea. Listen, Mahatma, we have a big forest of flowerpot trees up on a plateau above us. Say we set that on fire. Think you could see it?" "I don't see why not, even in this moonlight. Wait a minute till I call the other ships." Tom was getting into warm outer garments. Cesario got out the arc torch, and he and Tom and I raced out through the hut and outdoors. We hastened up the path that had been tramped and dragged to the waterfall, got the lifters off the logs, and used them to help ourselves up over the rocks beside the waterfall. We hadn't bothered doing anything with the slashings, except to get them out of our way while we were working. Now we gathered them into piles among the trees, placing them to take advantage of what little wind was still blowing, and touched them off with the arc torch. Soon we had the branches of the trees burning, and then the soft outer wood of the trunks. It actually began to get uncomfortably hot, although the temperature was now down around minus 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Cesario was using the torch. After he got all the slashings on fire, he started setting fire to the trees themselves, going all around them and getting the soft outer wood burning. As soon as he had one tree lit, he would run on to another. "This guy's a real pyromaniac," Tom said to me, wiping his face on the sleeve of his father's parka which he was wearing over his own. "Sure I am," Cesario took time out to reply. "You know who I was about 50 reincarnations ago? Nero, burning Rome." Theosophists never hesitated to make fun of their religion that way. The way they see it, a thing isn't much good if it can't stand being made fun of. "And look at the job I did on Moscow a little later." "Sure, I remember that. I was Napoleon then. What I'd have done to you if I'd caught you, too." "Yes, and I know what he was in another reincarnation," Tom added. "Mrs. O'Leary's cow." Whether or not Cesario really had had any past astral experience, he made a good job of firebugging on this forest. He waited around for a while, far enough back for the heat to be just comfortable and pleasant, until we were sure that it was burning well on both sides of the frozen stream. It even made the double moonlight dim, and it was sending up huge clouds of fire-reddened smoke, and where the fire didn't light the smoke, it was black in the moonlight. There wouldn't be any excuse for anybody not seeing that. Finally, we started back to camp. As soon as we got within earshot, we could hear the excitement. Everybody was jumping and yelling, "They see it! They see it!" The boat was full of voices, too, from the radio. "Pequod to Dirty Gertie. We see it, too, just off our port bow." "Yes, Bulldog, we see your running lights. We're right behind you." "Slasher to Pequod. We can't see you at all. Fire a flare, please." I pushed into the radio. "This is Walter Boyd, Times representative with the Javelin Castaways," I said. "Has anybody a portable audio-visual pickup that I can use to get some pictures to my paper with?" That started general laughter among the operators on the ships that were coming in. "We have one, Walt," Oscar Fujisawa's voice told me. "I'm coming in ahead of the Pequod scout boat. I'll bring it with me." "Thanks, Oscar," I said. Then I asked him, "Did you see Bish Ware before you left port?" "I should say I did," Oscar told me. "You can thank Bish Ware that we're out looking for you now. Tell you about it as soon as we get in."